The chandeliers threw a honeyed glow across polished silver, and a string quartet threaded Mozart through the hum of voices. Waiters skimmed between tables with a soft hush of linen and shoes, and the ice in the highball glasses clinked to a steady, brittle rhythm. My father stood at the podium in a tuxedo that fit like a verdict, his shoulders squared, his gaze bright, his voice clipped and controlled. He praised the firm, thanked the judges, nodded to the names that mattered. Then he lifted his champagne flute, turned those blue eyes toward me, and let the room tilt. "You," he said, calm as a closing argument, "are the biggest disgrace to this family." The quartet faltered. Forks froze midair. 300 heads pivoted in a single sweep. The crystal in his hand caught the chandelier light and trembled. "Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been measured only by what you refuse to become, tap the like button and share this with someone who will understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. To understand how a glass could feel like a gavel, you need to know the house where I learned to stand very still. I grew up in a brick colonial west of the city where the porch light burned with the steadiness of a promise, and the oak table never had a scratch. Our family calendar lived on the kitchen wall, color-coded, cross-hatched, and packed from dawn to dark. On Mondays, I hit the piano scales. On Tuesdays, I learned how to argue. On Wednesdays, I ran backhands to the line, and on Thursdays, I solved for X until the pencil groove marked my fingers. It looked like opportunity. It sounded like expectation. It felt like a narrow hallway with the doors shut. My father's name was on a mahogany door downtown Gold Leaf, catching the morning sun. People spoke of him with a certain lean in the voice, the way you talk about a man who always wins. My mother was the other kind of certainty, brisk and gentle at once. Her white coat, folded exactly her coffee mug, always rinsed. And then there was James, 2 years older, steady-footed, and easy with praise, the kind of son who fit their story like a hand slips into a glove. When I was little, my mother once caught me sketching in the back pew during a Thanksgiving service. She pressed a box of colored pencils into my palm later that night like it was a secret. "You have a soft eye," she said, almost apologetically, as if kindness needed permission. But even she couldn't weather my father's weather. He needed results, not atmospheres. He needed outcomes that could be framed, filed, and introduced into evidence. I learned early how to carry silence. The house hummed with a power that didn't make room for small displays of wonder. The day I won the 6th grade science fair, I ran home with a ribbon that still smelled like the gym floor. My father looked up, nodded, and said, "James won state at your age." The ribbon slid into a drawer and never moved again. There was one bright pocket that's never faded. I was 8 when he took my hand through the Museum of Fine Arts on a Saturday that should have belonged to depositions. He knew painters' names I didn't expect him to know, and spoke about light as if it were a case that could go either way. He bought me a paperback about the Impressionists and said, "You have a good eye, Haley." I kept those words like a pressed leaf inside a book, proof that once he saw me. By high school, excellence was a habit in our house, not a celebration. I hit my marks because missing them wasn't an option, but I spent my spare minutes in the art room breathing air that felt different from the rest of my day. Mrs. Lawson would stand behind my shoulder and say, "Push the darks, Haley. Let the shadows tell the truth." She entered my paintings into contests I didn't know existed. When a white envelope from Rhode Island School of Design arrived with a scholarship letter tucked inside, I held it to my chest and felt my life switch rails. The night I told them, the chandelier carved cold diamonds into the tablecloth. The china was set, the roast was perfect, the script was supposed to go one way. I slid the letter across the oak and said I wasn't going to Harvard. The sound that followed wasn't silence, it was a pressure, a space that clenched. My father folded his napkin with surgical precision. "No daughter of mine," he said, and his voice made it official. He slammed his fist. The wine leapt, and the stains spread like a wound. I slept on a friend's sofa and moved out the next morning with 2 suitcases and a box of brushes that rattled. What followed could fill a ledger and wouldn't impress a man like him. Coffee shifts until my hands ached. Museum tours in a tone that kept me from yawning. A 4th-floor studio apartment that smelled like other people's suppers and old rain. My scholarship paid for classes and paper. My pride paid for everything else. My mother mailed $20 bills tucked into cards with a care that made my throat tighten. James called on Sundays trying to keep both sides in the air. I pinned the rent receipt to the fridge like a ribbon. I built a life out of work and a language out of paint. I learned how to stretch a canvas tight as a drum and cut light from rough gesso. I learned that hunger sharpens edges and honesty does the rest. The first time a stranger stood before one of my pieces and cried a line inside me loosened. I sold 3 paintings in a Providence group show and laughed alone in my car with the windows up. I wasn't winning the world, but I was finally speaking in my own voice. Then there was Daniel. I noticed him because he noticed everything, the way a waiter steadied a tray with the back of his wrist, the way fog lifts off the river in layers. He carried his camera like a question. He didn't mind my quiet, and he knew how to be still without making it heavy. Our first winter together, he made a fire and asked about the painting I didn't want to show anyone. He looked at it for a long time and said, "You held back here, and that's okay. Next time, don't." We fit because neither of us needed the other to be impressive. We needed each other to be honest. Years later, when a curator in New York reached out, my hands shook as I opened the email. The Whitney wanted to hang my work beside names I'd once said like prayers. The world widened, not with noise, but with a deeper quiet, the kind where you can hear a small truth from a long way off. I told my mother. I told James. I did not tell my father. He knew how to find things when he wanted them. Then came the call about the retirement gala. The 4 Seasons ballroom. 300 guests in black and silver. My mother's voice deliberately bright, like someone carrying a tray carefully over ice. "He wants you there," she said, and left the rest hanging. I was 8 months pregnant, the baby's foot pressing under my ribs like a small fist knocking to be let in. Daniel sat with me at the kitchen table and turned the mug in his hands. He might be running a play, he said gently, or he might be trying. Hope can be a habit too, the kind you can't stop even when you tell yourself you should. The ballroom smelled faintly of roses and cold air. Ice sculptures of scales and gavels glittered as if justice could be frozen and still. We arrived a hair late, hoping the room would swallow us. An usher announced our names like a headline, and a wave of faces rolled in our direction. My mother reached me first, silver gown, careful smile, arms soft around the curve of my belly. James kissed my cheek, the kind of quick, bracing kiss that says I'm here, even if I can't fix it. My father worked the room like a man tending to a garden of reputation, clipping, watering, nodding, never once glancing our way. The speeches came in order, warm and polished, and full of stories rendered harmless by time. James spoke well, as he always has, and their applause for him was warm. I found my napkin hem and twisted it into a rope under the table, listening to the familiar cadence of excellence and sacrifice. I could have left then. I could have told Daniel I was tired and let the night pass without incident, but part of me wanted to give that 8-year-old museum memory one more chance to stand up. When my father took the podium, even the glasses seemed to quiet. He thanked the firm's names in a line that sounded like a genealogy. He talked about the law as if it were a country he'd fought for and built with his own hands. He gestured toward our table, praised my mother, praised my brother, and let the pause stretch before he landed on me. "Family legacy," he said, and the words were a stone rolling downhill. "Choices that dishonor it." He lifted the flute. He said the sentence. It wasn't loud, but it was designed to carry. Everything in me went very still, the way a room goes still before a storm breaks. The baby kicked hard as if to say, "I'm here." Daniel's hand found my wrist under the linen and held just enough pressure to remind me I wasn't alone. I stood slowly because my body needed time and because a slow rise draws a deeper quiet. The hem of the midnight blue dress brushed against my shoes. The carpet gave a little under my weight. 300 faces turned, not unkindly, not kindly, just hungry for what happens when the script goes wrong. I didn't have a speech. I had a sentence I had earned. "Then erase me from your will." I said, my voice steady as the table. "I never wanted your money. I wanted your love." The flute fell shattered, and no one moved to pick it up. You could hear the air conditioner hum. I set my napkin down with care, the way my mother taught me, the way she taught me to hold a fork and remember names and say thank you to people who wouldn't recall mine. I picked up my purse. I nodded to James, who looked as if the ground had tilted under his chair. My mother's hand fluttered at her throat, and she whispered my name. I touched her shoulder as I passed and said, "I know." Daniel stood when I did not as a shield, not as a soldier, just as my husband. We walked together through the quiet, my palm pressed against the small hill of my child, toward the heavy doors that seemed farther than they should have been. On the threshold, I felt the cool corridor air kiss my face and smelled the faint polish of floor wax and rain beginning outside. The quartet started again behind us, a careful, hopeful thread, as if the night could be stitched back together. I knew better. Some things are not repaired, they are rebuilt. The valet stand glowed in the wet light like a lantern at the edge of a field. A drop struck the stone, then another, then a slow, thoughtful rain. Daniel eased his jacket around my shoulders. We waited for the car while the city lifted its lights into the mist, and a siren wound a far, soft line down Boylston. When the attendant pulled up our old Volvo and stepped aside, he didn't look at me the way the room had. He looked at a woman who needed to sit down. I slid into the seat, adjusted the belt under my belly, and rested my palm where a tiny heel pressed back. Daniel started the engine. He didn't ask if I was all right. He knows I hate that question until I can answer it. Through the windshield, the ballroom windows shimmered behind the rain, a blur of light and silver, and practiced laughter mending itself. I watched one chandelier burn steady in the high corner, a small star refusing to blink, and felt a line cross inside me, like a stitch finally pulled taut. We pulled from the curb tires, whispering across wet stone. The wipers sketched a rhythm on the glass clearing and blurring the city coming into and out of focus as we turned toward the highway. Behind us, the doors sealed the speeches, resumed the story they told about themselves, closed its circle without me. Ahead, the road opened black and clean, and the rain deepened to a steady hush, like canvas being washed before it's ready for the first stroke. And somewhere between those two worlds, with the lights behind and the dark in front, I felt the first cold edge of loneliness settle beside me, and knew the night was only beginning. The highway shimmered with rainlight as we crossed the state line. The wipers brushed it away again and again, a steady rhythm over silence. Daniel's hand rested near mine on the console, not reaching just there. We didn't speak for miles. The baby pressed a foot against my ribs, reminding me of the life waiting to be born into all this. Outside, the world blurred into gray trees and white headlights. Inside, the air carried the taste of disbelief. At home, I slipped off my shoes at the door and left them beside the umbrella stand. The house was dark, except for the lamp in the kitchen window, the one we always left on for each other. Daniel made tea without asking. I sat at the table and watched the steam curl like smoke from something that had burned too long. He didn't try to fix it. He never does. He just poured the tea, slid the cup in front of me, and said softly, "You did the right thing." I wanted to believe that, but my hands trembled when I lifted the cup. The night had peeled something open inside me, something I'd kept buried under years of endurance. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the realization that I'd walked into that ballroom still hoping. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone, how it brightened when she said he wanted me there. Maybe she believed it too. Maybe she wanted her family to be whole for one evening, no matter what it cost. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake long after Daniel drifted off, listening to the rain slide down the windows. Around 3, I gave up padded barefoot to my studio and switched on a single lamp. The light touched everything I'd built, frames leaning against the wall, brushes in old jars, a canvas half covered in muted blues. I picked up the palette knife and began to work without thinking. Each motion was deliberate, slow, almost prayerful. Color over color, memory over memory. When the first streak of dawn touched the glass, a shape had formed, half light, half shadow, something breaking open. By morning, the phone had filled with messages. My mother's name appeared again and again. Short, frantic texts. "Are you safe? Please answer." Then James. "I should have stopped him. I'm sorry." I read each one and set the phone face down on the table. Daniel came in with 2 mugs and a look that asked without words. I shook my head. "Not yet," I said. The next few days moved like heavy water. I closed the gallery, told my assistant there'd been a family emergency. Sophia arrived unannounced, her voice loud in the quiet house. She filled the kitchen with the scent of roasted chilies and chopped cilantro, pretending not to notice my red eyes. "You feed yourself, or I'll start spoon-feeding you like a baby," she warned. Her blunt affection cracked through my numbness, and when she wasn't looking, I almost smiled. We ate at the counter, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us. She talked about her classes, her students, her parents' upcoming anniversary, ordinary things that anchored me. Then when the silence returned, she said what I hadn't dared to. "What he did was cruel, Haley. Not just unkind cruel." Her words hung in the air, sharp and clean. I nodded slowly. "I know." Later that afternoon, Daniel and I walked to the river. The air was cold enough to sting our cheeks. He slipped his arm around me as we watched the water darken under a low sky. "He'll reach out," Daniel said quietly. "Men like him always need the last word." I wanted to argue, but I didn't have the energy. I just listened to the sound of the current and thought about how much I still loved the father who had humiliated me. Love and pain so close, they almost sounded alike when spoken aloud. 3 days passed before the call came. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the tone before he spoke. "Haley," he said, his voice careful, controlled. "We should meet. There are matters to discuss." He didn't say, sorry, didn't ask how I was. He spoke as if this were an appointment to be confirmed, not a wound to be addressed. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Daniel was against it. "He doesn't deserve another chance to hurt you," he said, standing by the sink, drying his hands on a towel. "You owe him nothing." He was right, but I needed to see what remained after everything had been said. "I'll go," I told him. "But I'll go alone." The next afternoon, the Bristol lounge buzzed with lunchtime noise, china clinking, low conversation. the murmur of jazz from overhead speakers. He was already there, a dark suit pressed sharp enough to cut through memory. I noticed how age had softened his jaw, but not his posture. When he rose to greet me, his eyes flicked to my stomach before returning to my face. "You look well," he said, the lie polite and weightless. We sat. The waiter poured coffee for him, tea for me. I folded my hands around the cup to keep them from shaking. He spoke first, as always. "I saw your exhibition," he said. "The Whitney." His words caught me off guard. "You were there?" He nodded. "I had a conference in New York. I read the Times review. Decided to see for myself." I waited, but he didn't continue, so I asked the question he avoided. "Why now?" His fingers tapped the table, a rhythm I remembered from nights he reviewed case notes at his desk. "Because I realized," he said, pausing as if testing the phrase, "that you've made a life out of what I dismissed." He took a sip of coffee, grimaced slightly. "Your painting Fractured Legacy. It was about us." The sound of that title coming from his mouth made my stomach tighten. "It was," I admitted. "All the empty spaces, the pieces that didn't fit." He nodded once. "It wasn't what I expected," he said quietly. "It wasn't frivolous. It was the closest thing to praise he'd ever offered." I didn't answer. The waiter set down a small dish of sugar cubes, and for a long moment we both stared at it, as if either of us could sweeten what was already bitter. When he finally looked up, something in his expression had changed. "What I said at the party was unforgivable," he said, the word slow and deliberate. "Eleanor hasn't spoken to me since. James left early that night. You were right to walk away." I swallowed hard, unsure whether to feel relief or anger. "You humiliated me," I said softly, "and you knew what you were doing." He didn't argue. "Pride," he said simply. "It's been my only language for too long." He reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the table. "This isn't an apology," he said. "It's a trust fund for the baby. No conditions." The word hung there, baby, as if it belonged to both of us. "You can refuse it," he added, "but I want to do one thing right." Before I could respond, I heard my name. James stood at the entrance scanning the room. When he saw us, he crossed quickly, his face a mix of worry and quiet fury. "I knew he'd find a way to call you," he said, pulling up a chair without waiting. He turned to our father. "Did you apologize yet, or are you just offering money again?" My father stiffened. "This is between Haley and me." James shook his head. "No, it isn't. You made it public, remember? You turned her into a spectacle so everyone could see your disappointment. You owe her more than a check." His voice wasn't loud, but people were starting to notice. I put a hand on his arm. "It's all right," I said, but he didn't stop. "All my life I tried to earn what she never could, your approval, and it still wasn't enough." My father sat very still, his jaw tight. "I never meant," he began. "Intentions don't erase damage," James said, cutting him off. The words settled between us like dust. For a long time, none of us moved. Then I pushed the envelope back across the table. "What I need isn't money," I said. "It's love that doesn't come with conditions. My child will grow up knowing that difference." He looked at the envelope, then back at me, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "I don't know how to be that person," he said, "but I'd like to try." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't absolution, but it was something small, hesitant, human. When we left the restaurant, the afternoon light had turned soft, the kind that makes glass buildings look like water. James walked me to my car, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "You handled that better than I could have," he said quietly. "You always did." I smiled faintly. Maybe this time he meant it. James nodded, though doubt flickered in his eyes. "Maybe. But if he doesn't, you've already won." That night, I painted again. This time, the colors came lighter. Amber pearl traces of rose. The strokes weren't angry anymore. They were deliberate, measured, almost tender. I thought about my father's face when he said he wanted to try. I thought about the possibility that sometimes people change too late, and sometimes that's still worth something. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching me, the baby monitor quiet in his hand. "How was it?" he asked. I paused, considering. "Unexpected," I said. "But maybe the start of something small." He crossed the room, slipped his arms around my shoulders, and rested his chin near my temple. "Small things can grow," he murmured. Outside, the night pressed close to the windows, the kind that makes you notice every light left on. I leaned back into Daniel's chest, felt the slow rise and fall of his breath, and for the first time since the gala, the ache in my chest eased just enough to let air through. Somewhere between anger and forgiveness, there was a space wide enough for a single fragile hope. And as the paint dried on the canvas, I realized I wanted to see what could live there. The weeks that followed moved like water through narrow stones, slow, persistent reshaping things I thought were fixed. My father kept his word, at least in the small ways that mattered first. There were no grand gestures, no unearned apologies, just quiet consistency. He called every few days to ask how I was feeling, what the doctor had said, if Daniel needed help setting up the crib. His tone stayed formal, as though each question was being read from a script he was still learning. I answered politely, uncertain of how much to let in. When our daughter arrived, the world shifted again. Labor began in the early hours of a cold March morning. The hospital room was soft-lit and still, with the sound of monitors keeping time beside us. Daniel's hand never left mine. When she finally arrived, 8-pound-strong lungs, a shock of dark hair, everything else fell away. They laid her on my chest, warm and trembling, and she blinked up at me as if she already knew my voice. We named her Sophia Grace, after the woman who'd taught me that family could be chosen and love didn't require permission. In those first days, exhaustion and wonder blurred together. Daniel moved gently through the house, cooking simple meals, keeping the lights low. Friends from the art community sent flowers that crowded every surface. My mother came up from Boston with soup, a soft blanket, and 1,000 small instructions that filled the air like old music. She stayed 3 days quiet and kind, her hands constantly reaching for the baby. When she left, she kissed my forehead and whispered, "He wants to come when you're ready." 2 weeks later, my father arrived. He knocked instead of ringing the bell, stood at the door with his hat in his hands. Daniel opened it, gave a courteous nod, and stepped aside. My father paused on the threshold, eyes taking in the framed photographs, the soft disarray of a home that belonged to someone else's rhythm. When he saw the baby sleeping in my arms, something in his face softened. "May I?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and handed her over carefully. He held her like he'd held 1,000 legal documents, steady, cautious. But after a moment, his shoulders loosened. She stretched a small fist against his chest, and he chuckled under his breath, the sound unfamiliar, but genuine. "She's strong," he murmured. "Like her mother." For the first time, the compliment didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like pride. He didn't stay long. Just an hour, maybe less. He left a small silver rattle on the coffee table and said he'd call in a few days. As the door closed behind him, I realized my heart wasn't tight anymore. The anger was still there, but it had softened at the edges, replaced by a cautious peace I didn't yet know how to name. The months that followed became a rhythm of feedings, painting, and stolen naps. My studio filled with light again. I painted while Sophia slept her cradle near the window, the faint sound of her breathing keeping me steady. The work changed. It wasn't about pain anymore. It was about growth, small connections, the fragile beauty in what endures. Daniel called it the Healing Series, though I never gave it a name. One afternoon, as summer pressed against the glass, I received an invitation from the Providence Art Council. They wanted to feature my new collection at the fall exhibition. It would be my largest showing yet, an entire gallery wall dedicated to my work. I stared at the email for a long time, my heart racing. I hadn't realized until then how ready I was to be seen again, but this time without the need for anyone's approval. When I told Daniel, he lifted me off the ground in a quick, joyful hug. "You deserve this," he said, his eyes bright. "Every bit of it." Later that evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the sky, I thought about how much had changed in a single year. The woman who'd once left a ballroom in tears now had a child in her arms, a husband beside her, and a career that had grown quietly on its own terms. Still, I knew the story with my father wasn't finished. He called occasionally, sometimes asking about the baby, sometimes just to share a detail from his day. He never mentioned the retirement party again. Neither did I. It felt like both of us were walking across a fragile bridge plank by plank, hoping it would hold. In September, as I prepared the final pieces for the show, I received a letter postmarked from Boston. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping, an article about an upcoming lecture at the university where he'd once taught part-time. Attached was a note in his neat, deliberate handwriting. "Proud of you. I'll be there opening night. Dad." The night of the exhibition arrived with crisp air and the hum of early autumn. The gallery glowed from within tall windows, catching reflections from passing cars. Inside, guests wooed between displays, murmuring softly. Daniel greeted collectors while I lingered near the entrance, nervous in a way I hadn't felt in years. Then through the crowd, I saw them, my mother in a deep green dress, my father beside her, straight-backed, but less imposing than I remembered. When they reached me, my mother kissed my cheek, eyes shimmering. My father took my hand, briefly, almost awkwardly. "You've drawn quite a crowd," he said, his voice warm. "It's well-deserved." I thanked him, unsure what else to say. He looked around, taking in the paintings, the layered textures, the light breaking through dark color. "This one," he said, stopping before a large canvas of intertwined hands. "It feels personal." "It is," I replied. "It's called Roots and Wings." He nodded slowly, reading the small placard beside it, then turned back to me. "It's extraordinary," he said simply. "No qualifiers, no comparisons, just truth." As the evening deepened, the room filled with laughter and soft music. Daniel circulated with Sophia in his arms, her tiny head resting against his shoulder as admirers cooed over her. My father watched from a distance, smiling faintly. At one point, he approached Daniel and asked to hold her again. When he did, she gripped his tie and refused to let go. For a brief moment, his laughter broke through the years of silence that had weighed on us all. I found myself standing beside my mother, watching them. "He's trying," she said quietly. "In his own clumsy way, he's trying." I nodded, feeling the truth of it. So am I. After the guests left and the lights dimmed, the gallery settled into a soft hush. My parents lingered by the doorway as if uncertain how to say goodbye. My father cleared his throat. "We'd like to have you and Daniel and the baby for dinner soon," he said. "Just family. No speeches." I hesitated, then smiled. "I'd like that." When they finally left, Daniel slipped an arm around me, his voice low. "How do you feel?" I looked around at the empty space, the canvases glowing faintly under the soft light. "Like something closed tonight," I said. And something else just began. Outside, the street was quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. The air smelled of rain and possibility. As we loaded the last crate into the car, Sophia stirred in her carrier, a soft sigh escaping her lips. I reached in, brushed a finger across her cheek, and felt a steady calm settle inside me. For the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone to tell me I'd done well. I already knew. Yet beneath that calm was a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, the people who once broke me were learning how to love differently. The drive home was long and peaceful. The road curved through stretches of dark forest and open fields, the headlights carving a gentle path ahead. Daniel turned on the radio, an old jazz tune, filling the car with warmth. I leaned my head against the window, watching the reflection of our daughter sleeping behind me, and thought about the bridges we build, not because we expect perfection, but because some hearts deserve the chance to try again. By the time we reached the house, the moon had climbed high, silvering the roof and front steps. Daniel carried the baby inside, while I lingered at the porch, listening to the crickets. The night felt full, quiet, alive. I looked up at the stars and whispered a simple truth I'd been afraid to say for years. "I'm not a disgrace," I said softly. "I never was." Inside, the baby stirred, and Daniel called my name. I turned toward the light spilling through our doorway, knowing the next chapter was waiting just beyond it, one built on peace, not permission. Dinner at my parents' house came on the first Sunday of November, just after the clocks turned back and the light outside grew thin before 5. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves. Daniel drove while I sat in the passenger seat quiet, my hands folded over my coat. In the back seat, Sophia kicked her little shoes together and hummed softly to herself. The closer we got to Boston, the heavier the feeling in my chest grew, an old rhythm of anticipation and self-protection that never quite left me. When we pulled into the familiar driveway, the porch light was already on. My mother met us at the door with the same careful brightness she'd worn my entire childhood. Her hug was firm, but trembling, as though she wasn't sure if comfort was welcome yet. My father appeared a moment later, a little thinner now, his posture still formal, but his expression less guarded. "You're right on time," he said, stepping back to let us in. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The same paintings lined the hallway, and the same faint scent of polish hung in the air. We set Sophia's carrier on the living room rug, and she reached immediately for the silver rattle he'd given her months before. The sound of it broke the silence in a way that made everyone smile, even him. My mother disappeared into the kitchen, her voice floating back, asking about traffic, the weather, Daniel's work. The small talk felt like fragile glassware, necessary, but easy to break. Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds. My father poured wine, his hands steady, his gestures practiced. For a while, we spoke about unthreatening things: James's hospital schedule, a painting I was finishing for a private collection, Daniel's new series of landscape photographs. When Sophia began to fuss, my father surprised me by offering to walk her around the living room. He moved slowly, awkwardly at first, but when she settled against his shoulder, the tension in the room seemed to soften. Later, while my mother cleared dishes and Daniel helped her at the sink, my father and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily beside us. He studied one of the framed photographs Daniel had taken of my studio light pouring across a canvas brushes in mid-use. "That's a good image," he said quietly. "It shows the work behind what people see." I nodded. "That's what I love about his photography," I said. "He catches what's real before anyone poses." My father looked at me, then the corners of his mouth turning faintly upward. "He sees you," he said, almost to himself. It was a small sentence, but it felt like a door opening somewhere deep in the house. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then my mother returned with coffee and dessert, her eyes moving carefully between us, measuring the atmosphere like a weather vane. The evening ended without ceremony. My father walked us to the door, shook Daniel's hand, and kissed Sophia's forehead. When we drove away, the porch light followed us down the street like a quiet blessing. In the weeks after that dinner, we spoke more often, short phone calls, sometimes no more than a few minutes. He asked about Sophia's milestones, her first laugh, the beginnings of speech. My mother sent photos of their garden under snow. Little by little, the walls that had divided us began to crumble, not with a grand apology, but through small, steady gestures that cost him effort. By spring, I had begun a new series of paintings that felt different from anything I'd done before, gentler, lighter, built around the idea of renewal. I called it inheritance. It wasn't about money or name. It was about what we choose to carry forward. One morning, while I was stretching canvas in the studio, an email arrived from a curator in New York who had seen my work at the Providence show. She wanted to feature inheritance in a dual exhibition on family and identity. I accepted, half thrilled and half afraid. When I told my parents, my mother was ecstatic. My father listened, his face unreadable, and then said, "We'd like to come." I hesitated, remembering the last time he'd been in a public room with me at the center. He must have seen the doubt cross my face, because he added softly, "If you're comfortable with that." After a pause, I said yes. The exhibition opened on a mild September evening in the city. The gallery glowed with soft amber light, the air full of quiet conversation and the faint scent of fresh paint. My pieces lined the far wall, each one a blend of memory and color, childhood rooms, water-reflecting sky, the outline of a small hand in layered pigment. Daniel held my hand as we moved through the crowd, his touch grounding me. When my parents arrived, they didn't announce themselves. My mother wore navy silk, my father a simple gray suit. They made their way through the guests, stopping often to look at the work, speaking in low voices. When they reached the final piece, a self-portrait painted in pale tones, my face half turned toward the light, my father stopped. He studied it for a long time. Then he turned to me, his voice steady but thick. "I see now what I missed," he said. "I was so busy trying to build a legacy that I forgot to see the life already being lived." The words hung between us, quiet but solid. My throat tightened. "You can still be part of it," I said, "if you want to." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "I do." My mother reached for his hand, and for once he didn't pull away. The night went on like a slow exhale. Critics stopped to talk, buyers asked questions, but what stayed with me wasn't the attention. It was watching my father shake Daniel's hand, again longer this time, thanking him for standing by me when he hadn't. It was the sight of my mother holding Sophia, while they both laughed under the warm gallery light. When the last guests had gone and the staff dimmed the lights, I walked one final circuit through the room. The canvases glowed faintly, the brushstrokes catching the remnants of light. My father lingered near the doorway, coat over his arm. "You've created something meaningful here," he said quietly. "Something that matters." For him, that was a confession, a benediction, and an apology all at once. We stepped out into the street together. The city hummed around us, taxis, late-night diners, a saxophone somewhere down the block. The air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. My father offered his arm as we walked toward the car, an old habit returned from the past. I took it without hesitation. Back in Providence, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost new. Sunday dinners became a routine, rotating between our homes. James and Catherine joined, sometimes bringing laughter and the sense of something mended. My father still corrected grammar out of habit, still read case law for pleasure, but he no longer spoke of disappointment. Instead, he asked questions, listened more than he talked. One evening, after everyone had gone, Daniel and I sat on the porch with the baby monitor beside us and the scent of jasmine drifting through the night. The sky was clear stars sharp against the darkness. "It's strange," I said quietly. "I used to think forgiveness was something you gave all at once, but it's more like painting. You build it layer by layer until the picture changes." Daniel nodded. "And sometimes," he said, "it's beautiful before you even realize you finished it." Inside the monitor, Sophia stirred and then settled again. I leaned back, feeling the steady heartbeat of the home we'd built, fragile, once now firm. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the story with my father wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about the slow human work of understanding, about how two people can finally see each other after years of looking away. As the wind lifted, the chimes by the door sang softly. I thought of that night at the ballroom, the broken glass, the silence that followed. It felt far away now, like a photograph that no longer hurt to hold. The past hadn't disappeared, but it had found its place in the frame, no longer the whole picture, just a part of it. I looked through the open window where my daughter slept and whispered to the quiet house, "This is what peace looks like." Daniel squeezed my hand. The night deepened around us, steady and kind, carrying the promise of all that was still to come. Morning settles differently now. The house wakes with soft sounds, Daniel grinding coffee, the baby murmuring from her crib's sunlight, pushing through gauzy curtains in threads of gold. I move quietly barefoot on the hardwood, the boards warm beneath my feet. The air smells faintly of paint and the lavender candle I forgot to blow out last night. Peace doesn't announce itself. It seeps in like light, slow and certain, until you realize you've been living inside it. Our Sundays have grown into a ritual of ease. We take long walks through the park, Daniel, with the camera hanging loose around his neck, our daughter perched on his shoulders, her laughter scattering across the trees. The rhythm of our life feels simple in the best way, no longer an act of defiance, just a choice. The past doesn't sting as sharply anymore. It lingers like an old scar, visible but painless. My father still calls every week. Sometimes he visits, bringing books for Sophia or a new sketchpad he claims he just happened to find. The man who once measured worth by achievement now spends his days tending a small garden, writing essays he never intends to publish. He tells me the soil teaches him patience. I believe him. One afternoon in early spring, he asked if I would paint him. The request caught me off guard. "Not a portrait for display," he clarified, smiling faintly. "Something honest. The way you see me now." I agreed, but it took months before I started. I wanted to wait until I could look at him without anger, until the brush could move without old tremors. When I finally began, he came to the studio every Sunday morning. He'd sit by the window in his worn cardigan hands, resting on his knees, while Sophia played at his feet with colored blocks. The light would shift across his face as the hours passed, softening the lines that once seemed carved in stone. We talked about small things, books, art, the quiet discipline of doing something imperfectly, but with care. On the day I finished, I asked him to look. The canvas showed him exactly as he was, older, gentler, a man still learning how to love without control. He studied it in silence, eyes shining. "You've forgiven me?" he said at last, almost surprised. I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "I just stopped carrying it." He nodded, understanding what I meant. Sometimes letting go is the truest kind of forgiveness. Life unfolded gently after that. My gallery grew drawing students from across the state. I began offering weekend classes for young artists who couldn't afford formal training. We painted in the open air behind the gallery under a canopy of sycamores. Daniel documented their work, capturing the moments before color met canvas. The breath held the thought forming. I could see pieces of my younger self in each of them, the hunger for expression that doesn't ask for permission. My mother joined us often, bringing lemonade and cookies for the students. She'd stand near the easels, smiling, her hands dusted with flour from baking. She was happiest watching her family knit itself back together, not perfectly, but sincerely. My brother and Catherine came by on weekends too, and sometimes stayed for dinner. We no longer avoided the past. We simply didn't let it steer the conversation. In the evenings after Sophia fell asleep, Daniel and I would sit on the back porch with glasses of wine, the baby monitor humming faintly beside us. The garden he planted last summer had grown wild around the edges, lavender and sage spilling into the grass. The scent carried on the breeze, mingling with the salt from the bay. One night, as dusk settled deep and blue, he asked if I ever thought about that evening in Boston, the ballroom, the glass, the silence that followed. I looked at the horizon where the last light met the dark. Not often, I said, but when I do, it feels like a story that happened to someone else. He nodded, his hand resting over mine. That's what healing looks like, he said. I smiled. No, I whispered, this is what living looks like. In July, my father hosted a small family dinner at their house. Nothing grand, just us, James and Catherine, my parents, Daniel, and our daughter, toddling between the chairs. The same dining room that once held years of tension now echoed with soft laughter and the clinking of dishes. The chandelier light was warm instead of cold. At one point, my father lifted his glass and said simply, "To family." No speeches, no pretense, just the words themselves, plain and human. When we left that night, he walked us to the door. Sophia clung to his neck, refusing to let go until he promised to visit soon. Watching them together, I felt something loosen entirely, the last knot of resentment, the final shadow of what once was. My father caught my gaze, smiled gently, and said, "You made a beautiful life, Haley. It wasn't pride or ownership. It was acknowledgement, and that was enough." Autumn came again, painting the trees with amber and rust. I was preparing a new exhibit, smaller this time, built around the idea of inheritance, not the kind written in wills, but the kind we pass through, the way we love, the choices we make, the silence we finally break. The centerpiece was that portrait of my father. I named it The Lesson of Light. On opening night, he stood beside it, with his hands clasped behind his back, greeting visitors with the ease of a man finally comfortable in his own skin. I watched from across the room, realizing how rare it is to witness change so quietly and so completely. As the evening drew to a close, I stepped outside for air. The city lights shimmered over the water, their reflections bending in small ripples. Daniel joined me, sliding his arm around my shoulders. Behind us, the laughter from the gallery spilled into the street like faint music. I thought about the long road that brought us here, the hurt, the distance, the slow repair, and felt an unexpected gratitude for all of it. Somewhere inside, I understood what my grandmother once told me, that love isn't proven by perfection, but by presence. The staying, the trying, even after failure. That's what had saved us, not apology, not forgetting, but the daily decision to keep showing up. As we walked back toward the gallery doors, I turned for one last look at the river. The light on its surface trembled soft and endless. It looked like forgiveness, quiet, moving, and real. If you're still listening, I'd love to know where you're hearing this from tonight. Tell me your story, if you've ever had to rebuild peace on your own terms. And if this journey touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to remember that healing doesn't always roar. It often begins in silence. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of peace you build for yourself. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't victory, it's finally being able to breathe.